So, this past Thursday, I posted an episode that explored the specific economic situation that created the context for this year's Parks panel at the D23 event. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, you may want to click back one episode and explore that one first. That episode took a look at the most recent earnings report and earnings call from both Comcast, owner of the Universal Parks, and Disney. Both companies admitted that presently they were having problems in terms of park attendance in America. Neither company broke down the difference between the California and the Florida parks in terms of attendance numbers and revenue decline, but from having been in both the California and Florida parks very regularly this year, I can tell you that the visitation problem is more significant in Florida than it is in California. And here's the interesting or troubling part for Disney. Despite every other sector at the Disney company doing well right now, including the streaming business that at least overall finally made a small profit, and theatrical having two significant hits with Inside Out 2 and Deadpool 3, investors weren't happy with the company's performance, which was almost wholly based on reduced revenue from the American resorts, which was down 6%. There are a number of factors that contributed to this. Some of them are outside Disney's control, but some of them are not. Generally, here's that list. First, a strong dollar has meant that middle to upper class families are taking this opportunity for an overseas vacation, particularly in Europe and in Asia. In America, the Fed continues to keep interest rates high, which leads to a stronger dollar compared to other currencies. This summer, the dollar was at a 30-year high compared to the Japanese yen, and overall the dollar is 10% stronger than it was 3 years ago. Essentially, this means that with the current exchange rate, overseas travel is significantly cheaper than it has been for years, with also an expectation that when the Fed lowers interest rates, the dollar will lose strength against foreign currencies. In other words, some families are using this time to take a discounted vacation overseas. Second, some middle to lower class families are concerned about the economic outlook for the U.S. GDP growth is down significantly this year. It was 1.4% in the first quarter of 2024 compared to 3.4% in the fourth quarter of last year. This means that with an unsure financial future, some families are simply less willing to take an expensive summer vacation such as the Disney World. Third, Disney has been over-reliant on what I would call their superfans to support their parks through annual passes and DVC. And in our last episode, we broke down the differences between Disney's plans under Michael Eisner, who built far more hotels for traditional cash tourists, and Disney's plans under Bob Iger, who built far more hotels for DVC tourists. And there's nothing wrong with the investment in the superfan segment, such as through DVC, that can be profitable. The problem is that the investment in the superfan segment has been done in part at the expense of investment for traditional tourists, which are the majority of Disney Resort customers. Anyway, we talked about those numbers a lot in the last episode, and I won't do that again here. Fourth, a spike in post-COVID domestic travel in 2021 and 2022 contributed to a lull in domestic travel in 2023 and so far in 2024. Essentially, a lot of families a couple of years ago, following the restrictions of COVID, took their once every 3 or once every 4 or 5 year trip to Disney World or Disneyland, which meant that they won't return for another 3, 4, or 5 years. But, without doubt, the absolute big reason park attendance is down is the lack of strong investment in attractions of scale and size in the parks. Comcast, in their earnings call, indicated that it was primarily large attractions at Universal, such as the Velocicoaster, that spiked visitation at their parks, not smaller attractions like that one themed to the Minions and Villains Con. And nighttime shows and parades, at least for Comcast, were nowhere on their list in terms of attendance drivers. Comcast and Universal believed, barring any significant economic downturn, that Epic Universe would solve visitation problems at the Universal Orlando Resort. They also believed that a new Fast and Furious roller coaster would likely solve problems over at Universal Hollywood. This created the context where Disney finally needed to respond. Sadly, it wasn't so much to respond to fans' desires to have a new wave of engaging experiences in the American parks. It was rather a response to the investor lack of confidence that the American Disney parks would continue to be a strong economic center for the company. The announcements at D23 were larger than I expected and a little more complicated. I was going to do this all in just 2 episodes originally, but to keep things moving and to keep episodes showing up on a regular basis, I think I'm going to break this down into smaller groupings arranged around individual parks. So today we'll take a look at the first set of announcements for Florida, specifically in Animal Kingdom. We'll look at the viability of these plans and if these plans are going to satisfy fans and investors. And then tomorrow we'll take a look at another area. And finally, when we're all done with the parks, we'll take a look at the entertainment announcements as well. This week, you will see shows popping up very quickly. You'll have something new to listen to most days on your walk or your drive to work or simply as you relax around the house. Each day for the parks, I'll also put together a short video that shows art and models for those segments that we explore on that episode. So if you haven't pushed the follow button for our podcast yet, you might want to push that, as pushing that button will slot these episodes quickly into your podcast feed. So, if you're ready, here we go. Today, we'll walk down the first set of announcements. We'll move through them in detail so you'll have a full sense of what's been overtly or subtly revealed so far, along with what's been pointedly left out. That is, instead of simply listing what's been announced, we'll look for the subtlety and nuance in these announcements to create a much fuller picture. But before we do that, we need to add in 2 more elements. Most, but not all of these announcements were made at the Honda Center during the D23 event for a crowd of roughly 12,000 people. The Honda Center is an indoor sports stadium where the Anaheim Ducks play. For a D23 event, this space is absolutely huge. The first element we need to add into our discussion is this. To keep the mood in the room positive, announcements like this are almost always focused on what is coming rather than what might be going away to make room for something new. One silent question in the presentation is almost always what will be lost, if anything, to make space for a new attraction. That will be particularly important for a set of announcements that we'll discuss later this week. And second, I don't know what Disney was thinking, but the format for this year's presentation was kind of bonkers. It wasn't well matched to the content that was presented, and sections of the crowd reacted negatively to this. So let's talk about this quickly for a little bit up front. Then we'll just put all of this aside. The show opened with a 1980s cover band dressed as characters from Alice in Wonderland, who sang for 20 minutes with none of their selections having any strong connection to a Disney film. There was a Prince song, an a-ha song, a Michael Jackson song, and so on. The band was absolutely talented, but it just didn't connect with the audience. During this period, there were some people near me who were somewhat into the performance, but about half of those around me were simply scrolling through their phone or sending texts. And I think, even at this point, The presentation could have recovered from this misstep if it went more directly into a discussion and preview as to what was planned for the parks and other experiences such as the cruise line. But the presentation didn't go in this direction. Instead, it went down the rather unusual path of having one musical performance, including by some genuinely famous performers such as Shabuzi and Rita Ora, both of whom did cover songs. Probably the oddest moment of the night was after Josh D'Amaro, who oversees the Disney parks and experiences, acknowledged that some of Disney's past announcements were canceled and never built. In theme park communities presently, the joke is that half of what Disney announced is never built, but nearly all of what Universal announces ends up in the parks. So Josh D'Amaro made the joke that he would do more than promise that these attractions were already in development and would move forward toward construction quickly. Instead of promising, he said that he would do even more. He would swear. And then, continuing that flashback heart attack music theme of the evening, the four members of the 1990s R&B group All for One came on stage to sing their hit from 3 decades ago, the one that goes like, "I swear." In all of this, there was an extremely unusual choice to merge the world of current theme park announcements with the world of 1980s and 1990s pop music selections. These two worlds really don't dialogue well with each other, and for the most part, you don't really hear pop songs of the 1980s and 1990s when you're inside of a Disney park or on a Disney cruise. It was sort of like one of those Oscar shows that wasn't going well. And to borrow the phrase once again from All for One, I swear that there was a moment early in the event where Josh D'Amaro, who was a smart person and good at reading a crowd, stood on stage and seemed to look out over the audience and realize that this format wasn't playing well to much of the crowd, but also understood that there were still 2 more hours left of it to go. Music, then announcement, then more music, including an American Idol winner singing the Madonna song Like a Prayer. And yes, I know there's a tie-in there to Deadpool 3, but I think a lot of that was lost on the people actually at the Honda Center. To be fair, the Disney Parks division isn't in the business of creating stadium shows. And also to be fair, there were 3 moments in this format that did actually engage nearly everyone in the audience. The song Trust in Me was a good setup for the final announcement that we'll talk about later this week, but also that was a Disney song. The appearance of Deadpool, actually there on stage, was needed comic relief with many of his jokes well delivered, including how Josh D'Amaro was on fire tonight. And then, after a slight pause, the punchline, just like the Phantasmic Dragon. And lastly, Billy Crystal, who knows how to entertain a large crowd, was fabulous as always. But the overall format, which was not what the crowd expected, disengaged a good chunk of that audience, which might have led to lower enthusiasm for some announcements as they were made. This context, too, will also matter for some announcements that we'll explore later this week. So, if you have all that, let's get into what was announced for the Animal Kingdom with commentary as to what this means for the future of the Florida resort. Perhaps the first thing to notice here is that for the most part, the presentation was a hard pivot away from announcing clone attractions, such as those announcements from a few years ago that brought Galaxy's Edge to both coasts, Tiana's Bayou Adventure to both coasts, Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway to the other coast, the Hatbox Ghost to the other coast, and so on. With the exception of one minor upgrade to an existing ride, everything that was announced for Florida was meaningfully unique to Florida, and everything that was announced for California was unique to California. The overseas announcements, which were few, also mostly brought unique attractions to those parks. Beneath this, quite clearly, is an attempt to draw regular Disney visitors to different resorts, which may be a more effective plan to increase overall visitation than simply trying to get Florida regulars back to Florida more often and California regulars back to California more often. Another thing to know up front is that there's already controversy about two announcements, and honestly, I would say that that controversy is probably loud enough to possibly alter one of the planned attractions and possibly loud enough to cancel the other. But we won't get to those announcements until later this week. Anyway, let's start with the Animal Kingdom. We've talked about the Tropical Americas edition for a while, but we now have more details, including an opening timeline. We also have an official name, Pueblo Esperanza, which in Spanish means village or perhaps town of hope. In terms of additions of scale and size that might increase visitation, this area, compared to other large announcements, will be the quickest to repurpose and also to counter-program against Epic Universe over at Universal. This is because this expansion will reuse many buildings, also one ride system. A number of current buildings will remain in the area, including the Restaurantosaurus structure, and at least the ride system will remain from Dinosaur, probably also much of its show building. But even with this, the opening target date, as announced, is 2027, which is exactly what we've been suggesting for months now. This basically means that Epic Universe will have free reign as the new thing in Orlando for 2 years, with Disney likely being forced to offer sizable hotel discounts, various discounted ticket packages, free dining, and so on, especially during the off-season, for 2 whole years. But let's look at the expansion itself and what's coming to Animal Kingdom. One side of the Tropical Americas area will be focused on the Indiana Jones retheme of the dinosaur attraction. The current artwork shows a much smaller pyramid, which is probably more realistic to build, especially in a timely manner. In fact, in the presentation model, the pyramid for the Indy ride is actually significantly smaller than the Magical Casita over in the Encanto area. These two areas are separated by trees, so the size comparison won't be noticeable once you're on the ground. Inside the Indy show building, the ride will be different from other Indiana Jones experiences already made by Disney. This next quote is from the Disney Parks blog. A new Indy experience is set to arrive in Disney's Animal Kingdom and will be different from any other Indiana Jones experience around the world. In this new venture, the man with the hat has recently discovered a perfectly preserved Maya temple, and that can only mean one thing. It's time to explore it. He's heard rumors about a mythical creature deep within the temple, and he's got to see it for himself. So he brings us along on the adventure. But will there be snakes? We'll just have to wait and see. So the clues in this announcement are that the ride will be focused on some type of animal connection with the rest of the park, specifically a mythical creature. In Mayan mythology, there's a winged serpent, essentially a giant snake that can fly and has feathers. Will that be the center of this experience? I don't know, but that creature does pull together a few of the clues into a coherent image. The anchoring attraction for the other side of Tropical Americas will be a ride-through of the Magical Casita from Encanto. The story breakdown for the attraction is this. Guests arrive on the day that Antonio receives his magical power to talk with animals. Guests are seated in ride cars that look like furniture that then glide through the house to experience many different rooms, including We Don't Talk About Bruno, before finally arriving at Antonio's room, which is filled with animals, and again here makes a strong thematic connection to the overall identity of Animal Kingdom. The artwork that was released has been cropped in an interesting way to hide the type of ride system used in this attraction. You can still see the tops of guests' heads and the top of the ride vehicles, but it's impossible to see exactly what type of ride vehicle is being considered for this experience. That could mean that this aspect of the attraction isn't yet fully nailed down. But reasonable guesses based on the little visual information that we presently have might be something like a trackless system or an omni-mover system, both of which would be arranged like pieces of furniture. The presentation model has an enormous show building behind the casita facade, suggesting that this ride will be long and involved, probably something that could legitimately be called an e-ticket. The show building area is roughly the same size as the show building for the current dinosaur ride. At the presentation, we were told that construction for this area will be arranged in phases. What I think this means is that guests will have access to dinosaur at least through the peak period of the 2024 winter holidays, maybe longer, possibly even most of 2025. The show building for the new Indiana Jones ride is already there. It's just going to take over the one that exists for Dinosaur. The ride system and ride course are also already there. What needs to happen is essentially a full re-theme of the show building, replacing various sets, which will take far less time to complete than building an entirely new attraction such as the Encanto Casita. Indiana Jones rides at Disney parks tend to have only a few animatronics, such as a giant snake, a couple of nondescript indie figures, and so on, and a lot of projection, atmospheric, sound, and fire effects. I would assume that this will also be true for the Florida version, which means that the install time should easily be under 2 years, maybe even a year and a half or less. So if Disney is willing to move guests around the construction site to get to the dinosaur attraction, the dinosaur attraction could stay there for a while more. Animal Kingdom is also a park with very few attractions that are considered big draws. There's Flight of Passage, Kilimanjaro Safaris, Kali River Rapids, Expedition Everest, and Dinosaur. Take away Dinosaur and you take away 20%. It looks like there will be an effort now to keep Dinosaur open as long as possible. So get ready to see a path near construction walls and those rolling hedges that will bring you over to the entrance of Dinosaur. But it does look like there will be an effort made to keep this attraction open, largely for capacity as long as possible. The third attraction for this Tropical Americas area will be a new carousel, where all of the animals will appear to be carved by hand. The backstory here is that all of the animals were supposedly carved by a local Pueblo Esperanza woodcarver who made stylized creations of his favorite Disney animal characters for the carousel. This will be a nice addition for kids too short to ride the Indy attraction. Lastly, we were given an opening date and new name for the Zootopia retheming of the Tree of Life attraction. It will be called Zootopia, Better Zootgether. And yes, that's actually with a Z. Based on the poster, it will feature Nick Wilde, Judy Hopps, and Clawhauser, the cheetah from the film. It will open winter 2025, so this rather sadly will be one of the main two elements around which Disney will arrange their counter-programming to Epic Universe next year. But let's finish off this first episode with some things that were not announced. One of the things that was not announced in the Tropical Americas presentation, nor was it included in the artwork, was the integration of actual animal exhibits similar to those in the Africa and Asia sections of the park. There was also no announcement of a new nighttime show for Animal Kingdom or for any new show for that 5,000-seat outdoor amphitheater on Discovery River. Outside of Animal Kingdom, here's some other things that were not announced. Disneyland Forward as a whole was never explored, though perhaps pieces of that plan were touched on in what was discussed on stage. Beyond this, there were no specific plans to develop the parking lot areas in Anaheim, including that very large Toy Story parking lot where Disney previously suggested they might develop something like a Disney Springs shopping, entertainment, dining, and hotel area. Also, there was no announcement for any expansion to World Showcase, perhaps for a South American country such as Brazil, but also D23 is going to have a second 3-day event this year in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I believe their thinking is this: the second largest Comic-Con in the world is in Brazil, so this would be a likely place to launch an international version of what essentially is Disney's version of Comic-Con. But the Brazil D23 event might be a more likely space to make the announcement of something like a Brazil pavilion coming to World Showcase, if in fact that's still under consideration. I would also suspect that the Brazil D23 event would be the location where we would finally learn more about the Tropical Americas project, particularly as it relates to Central and South American culture. But beyond Animal Kingdom, there were a lot more attractions and full lands that were announced, and we'll get to more of them tomorrow. I'll be back in a day with another episode. I'm trying to do two things here. I don't want to simply list off what was announced. I want to take us down a far more nuanced path to explore the subtleties of what's being planned for Florida and California. But also, I want to get these discussions out there as quickly as I can, so I'm simply going to post podcast episodes and videos as soon as they are done all this week. And this is why it is important that you hit that follow button so that these episodes quickly populate in your podcast feed as soon as they are published. Also, as promised, to supplement today's discussion, I have a short video of the Tropical Americas Pueblo Esperanza area, which includes multiple models, various artwork, and even a completed figure. I have a direct YouTube link in our show notes today. Also, I have a landing page for all of our podcast videos over at DHIpodcast.com. Lastly, as you know, we are an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find well over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link for that down in our show notes today. So, until sometime tomorrow, this is Todd James Pierce.